All right. I can see that some people are actually watching, which I find quite interesting. That even though I just said, I'm going to do a live stream on academic writing, I didn't think that anyone would actually be there and watch it. So welcome to those that are actually having a look and are tuning in. I hope you can actually hear me. I'm not quite sure. I'm again using a completely different setup, which I haven't used this semester too much. So I hope that's going to work. Maybe just as a very brief comment, I'm actually going to have a look at the chat, because I can see that on my other screen. So if there are any questions, then I'm just going to have a regular look at the chat. If there's anything you want me to explain, if there's anything you want to ask, feel free to ask that. That isn't a problem. But other than that, I'm just going to, I think, jump straight in. This is, as I've already said, a live stream on academic writing. This is the slide we should all be seeing, so I can see that on the live stream. You can probably see that too. Okay, what we're going to do today, or what I'm going to very briefly do, and I know I say briefly, and then again it probably won't be briefly at all, but this is the structure. The first thing we're going to have a look, and I'm just going to take away the camera for a sec. So what we're going to have a look, or what I'm going to have a look at, is at least common problems. So I did the survey and the questionnaire, and I think I said something about to that effect last week in the Tuesday morning seminar, but I'm going to say that here, and of course in a bit more detail. So the common problems, then I'm going to go through each of the phases of academic writing. So we'll briefly talk about finding your topic, about initial research, about conceptualization, and so on and so forth. And then I'm going to talk about writing, the introduction, the main part, the conclusion, and the aftermath. So basically just bibliography and all of the kind of small things that go in with academic writing, or that go together with academic writing. And I think I have to very briefly switch and for 2 slides, which you might be needing to see. Okay, and I can go back to this, hoping that it works. Let me just very briefly do that again, and I hope nothing, yeah, there we go. This is not what you are supposed to see. So let me very briefly go back to the beginning. It's always lovely, so well prepared. I mean, okay, all right. Now I'm finally done. We can now start. Again, if there's anything you want to know, anything you want me to clarify, feel free to ask me anything in the chat, with anything, of course, referring to anything concerning academic writing. Okay, so this is the structure that I'm going to go through, and I did look through the most common problems that you've basically given me, and those were mostly lie in the conception phase, which I can understand on the one hand, and I find quite interesting on the other hand, because I always thought, the conception phase is actually the easiest, because you have your seminar topic and then you just kind of go through the individual presentation topics and you kind of find your term paper topic, going through that. But obviously that isn't so much the case. The second problem, of course, lies in writing, with citation and other following that quite quickly. And I did look at the other kind of specification, and that was mostly citation and central theme, leading the paper to a specific conclusion, finding a topic, narrowing down literature, citation, bibliography, conception, academic writing in general, introduction, etc., etc. So of course I cannot really give you a specific guidance on questions such as just going to move my camera because you can't see anything at the moment. I can't really give you a specific framework for how to write academically, or how to write academic papers in this case. This is something you just have to practice quite a bit. And I think I said that last week. It's really important that you sort of practice as much as you can. And, you know, practicing both writing but also speaking. Sometimes it even helps if you write down a complete presentation. I know most people don't really want that, but that might actually be helpful just in order to practice academic writing a bit. So I cannot give you everything, so to speak, but I'm just going to at least go into more detail on the conception, not so much as the general problems say, not so much on the writing. I do have some examples of kind of a good introduction or a not so good introduction, and that is always, you know, this is something that works really well in a seminar, but I'm not quite sure whether it works really well in a live stream, so that might be a bit awkward for me and you. Anyways, moving on. So those are the general problems, and we're starting right on with the topic. So a good start, or a good starting point for kind of figuring out what you actually want to write about, is to look at the questions or main themes that you've covered in each seminar. So usually the seminar plan is pretty in-depth in some form. So we, as lecturers in this case, we do provide you with both presentation topics, but also with general questions that you could level both at texts, but also level in general. So sometimes it's about national identity, sometimes it's only about sexuality, sometimes it's most to do with or more to do with a certain text. So if you've been in my Monday seminar, then we've of course dealt with Lady Chatterley's Lover above all other texts. But you know, we usually tend to give you a pretty good framework of what is possible in the confines of this seminar. A second question would also, or a second idea would be to ask yourself, what are you actually interested in? So what would you like to explore? I think there was a seminar a couple of years ago where someone was really interested in the dinosaurs, which was this sort of 90s sitcom on Super RTL. Anyways, but he wanted to write about the kind of the negotiation of later life in this sitcom. So this is, for instance, something, if that's of interest, then just try to have a look how you can sort of frame that in the confines of the seminar. So your term papers and your presentations shouldn't stray too far from your seminar topic or from the seminar topic. So if you write something, or if you take a seminar on sexuality, maybe talking about national identity in some obscure 1980s film might not be too appropriate. But generally, you know, use the framework of the seminar and then just have a look at what are you actually interested about. And these sort of, the purpose of these term papers is, of course, to convince the reader, in this case, me, of your argument. So this is also something, you can also start with an argument if you have something where you say, you know what, this is really something I'm convinced of. It's, of course, not an opinion piece, you know, you're not writing a blog article, but you're writing a term paper. But sometimes you have one argument or one goal that you're working towards. So in my bachelor thesis, for instance, I wanted to show that Hogwarts is actually a really stringent system of surveillance that is very problematic. And this was my goal, and I focused on that. So even that would be a way of conceptualizing or actually finding a topic. And if you have something, if you have an idea, if you have a rough idea even, or if you know a rough direction, this is the point where you could actually go to your lecturer, go to your teachers and ask them if that's okay, if they would, if they could give you a hint, for instance, if that's something they can help you with. Or sometimes it's just that people, and this is of course sort of more a personal thing, people come to me with very broad topics, with very broad ideas, and sometimes you can just by talking to them in conversation, you can sort of narrow it down, or if it's too narrow, you can widen it up for a bit. So there are certain things you can do in order to actually find your topic. And if you have no idea at all, then of course talking to your lecturers and your teachers is the best way to do that and the best way to go. If you've found the topic, and I'm just going to go through, I believe it's 2 examples. One should be exactly. Something for the Monday evening seminar. So this is something I've sort of come up with. This is sort of the process that should go on to find your topic. So let's say you're really interested in the historic developments with regard to later life, or not to later life sexuality, that would be my topic, but with regard to sexuality. So this is, of course, far too broad. So you need to narrow it down. So either you say, you know what do I actually want to cover? Which period do I want to cover? Do I want to trace a development? Do I want to trace the development of, birth control from 1795 to 18 something? So you need to kind of have a look, which period do you want to cover? Do you want to focus on a specific class? Is there a specific point that is of interest? And if you ask those questions, you narrow the topic down. So you, for instance, come to the point where you say, you know what, I want to examine how family and family values impact sexuality, because this is something we've talked about quite extensively in the seminar. And even that would be a potentially very good dissertation or potentially very good book, but it's not really appropriate for a term paper, at least the term papers we write, that is 3 to 5 pages or 5 to 15 pages. This is still far too broad. So you narrow it down even further, and you, for instance, ask, again, which time period do I want to focus on? What values specifically do I want to focus on? Do I want to focus on certain intersections? Is it class or race or gender? Which part of society? Is it upper class, middle class, lower class, working class? Is it a certain gender, race, class, etc., etc.? So these are the questions that usually, again, narrow down your topic to a certain degree, until you come, for instance, to this conclusion, say, you know what, I want to really focus on the middle class family values in the beginning of the 20th century. So you've got period and class in this case, and how marriage actually shapes the sexual agency of women. And this is, for instance, something you could, if you find a text, for instance, Lady Chatterley's Lover or any other book, this is a question you could level at a longer term paper. So we're talking about 20 to 25 pages here. That would be appropriate. That would potentially also be appropriate for a bachelor thesis or a master thesis. So this is something you could arrive at. You have a very certain period, you have very certain class-based values you want to explicitly look at. You have a certain social institution that you want to look at. This is still far too broad for a term paper, but it is not as broad as, the historic developments of sexuality. And again, you have to narrow it down even more. At least if you're in this seminar on Monday, then you would have to say, you know what, I need a suitable text where I could sort of trace these developments. And this would, of course, be, where Lady Chatterley's Lover, for instance, comes in. This would be your main text where you can trace these middle class values in the beginning of the 20th century with regard to marriage and the sexual agency of women, for instance. So either you find a text that suits your needs in this case, or you just take the text we have already had in the seminar. And what would come, if you take Lady Chatterley's Lover, then your final, very narrowed down point would be that you want to focus on how Lady Chatterley's Lover, in this case, negotiates the sexual agency of women if women are situated in particular domestic circumstances. And because this is still all right, but this is not exactly a thesis. It's not really your hypotheses yet. But the hypotheses, and I put that on the slide, would be where you really tell your reader, in this case where you want to go, what do you want to do with this paper, the direction this paper will take. And that would be, in this paper, I will examine how Lady Chatterley's Lover negotiates the sexual agency of married middle-class women in the beginning of the 20th century. And that gives me already everything I need. I know the text you're working with, I know the period you're working with, I know that it's narrow enough that you can actually do that on 5 to 10 pages. I know basically everything, and I kind of know where this is going because obviously I've read the text, so I have a rough idea of where this is going. And this would be your thesis statement. This is your basically the end point of your introduction. That should be, at the end of it. And this would be a starting point, for instance. From this on, you can write about, you have all the theoretical points that you need to write this term paper. You know which text it is about. You know what you need. You need to explain what sexual agency is. You need to address the question of gender in the beginning of the 19th century. So what gender ideals do we find? We come straight from the Victorian period, where the angel in the house is still very popular. Women should be seen but not heard. Women are very passive with regard to sexual matters. So, you have a historic context, so to speak, that you can address. You have a gender theory that you should address because you're talking about women. You can address the question of middle class sexual agency and how sexual matters and class are actually tied in with each other. And you have, again, the text. So this would be, it already gives you the theoretical framework as well as the historic context within which you work. And this also forms your theoretical part, so the theoretical framework of your paper, for instance, because it would be, again, gender theory, but also the historic context. And then you can go off into the analyses, so to speak, that is Lady Chatterley's Lover. For those of you that have taken the Tuesday morning seminar, I also have an example, but I think I've already given that last week. That would be that you're really interested in the rural conceptions of England. Again, far too broad. This is something you could probably do in a Habilitationsschrift. Wouldn't probably, be very good in a term paper. And the shorter the term paper is, the least likely it is to use that topic, or the least practicable it is to use that topic. So you would narrow it down and you would say, what do I want to cover? Do I want to trace a development again? Is there a specific point or medium that I want to have a look at? So am I going to look at rurality in British literature? Am I going to look at rurality in, I don't know, some art house films of the late 20th century? Very different. And all of these films and all of these medium, or the media, kind of give you certain frameworks that you need to kind of keep in mind. So that is, again, too broad. You would narrow it down to, you want to examine how rural images of England are used in visual culture. Again, far too broad. You need to really specify what kinds of visual culture you want to look at, what kinds of intersections are significant. Again, race, ethnicity, class. Very interesting to have a look at that. You would also want to focus and narrow it down further if you want to focus on the representation of a rural England in television series in the 21st century. Again, far too broad. You would need one or two texts. I think the shorter the term paper is, the less text you should be using, which is why you need to find a suitable text that does that kind of either supports your argument from the start off, or something that kind of deconstructs your argument. You need to find a text, appropriate text, or you should focus on one of the texts in the seminar. Also, and this is something I'm going to say, and I think I said that last week, but I'm going to say that again, because, this is something I can say more often, or I can say a lot often, or a lot more often than I usually do, and that is the question of representations. Usually people come to me with topics such as, I want to have a look at the representation of, women in the film, Little Women. It's not a film, it's, I think, a television series. Anyways, but you want to look at the representations. And the problem is, same thing goes with, I want to look at the attitudes towards this, that, and the other. The problem with attitudes and representation is always that it's incredibly descriptive. And if you focus on the representation, how is something shown on screen, for instance, you never really go into any sort of analysis. So the thing is, you tie yourself down with talking only about representations. What you can talk about, and it's just a formulation kind of thing. So what you could talk about is, for instance, the way things are negotiated, the way things are deconstructed, the way things are constructed. So look at the function these things have. Look at the way these texts negotiate things, how they place things and locate things, but don't look at representations. Even though representations are, of course, important, but focusing only on representation shouldn't really be what you do. So having said that, what you want to focus on if you use that line of argument or this sort of framing would be to look at how Downton Abbey constructs Englishness by using images of rurality. And this is where you kind of circumvent the representation thing. Of course, you still look at representations of a rural England, but you ask a different question, namely, how do these images function? What purpose do these representations have? Namely, they construct something, and representations are never just there. They always have a purpose, they always have a function. So they construct things, they deconstruct things, they subvert. All of these, that is something you should keep in mind about these representation and negotiation questions. So your thesis statement at the end of your introduction, for instance, could be, or that could also be, for instance, the start of your introduction. So, if you have 3 to 5 pages, you need to narrow it down. You need to shorten the amount you write in a way, especially the amount of introduction you write. So if you have 1-page introduction in a 3 to 5 page essay, that's a bit too much, I can already tell you, unless your introduction is really good and you cover a lot of things, but I'm pretty sure that this mostly isn't the case. So you really need to shorten it down, and this would make a good start into this term paper if you say in this paper, I will explore how the first episode of the television show Downton Abbey constructs Englishness by using images of picturesque rurality. Again, you give yourself a certain theoretical framework already. You can talk about the construction of national identity, of how television does that, and how television and visual culture actually help to construct these images of Englishness, or these images of England. Just let me check the chat. Nothing's going on, so I'm just going to ramble on. Do I have anything else to say about the thesis statement? I think not. If I have, I'll go back, but let me go on. So after you've done that, after you've sort of narrowed down your topic, you have your topic, you've talked to me about your topic, you probably have a rough structure already. Maybe I have given you a couple of tips and tricks. This is how you get started. And research and sources, and I think I ranted on that last week, this is one of the most significant steps in writing a term paper. It's still very much the conception, very much sort of the framework you do, but this is an incredibly important step. So what you do then, after you have your topic, you pick out which parts you need to theoretically frame, where you need to put research in, and so on and so forth. So you get started by checking out all the material that I have provided. For instance, sometimes I do give recommendations of, oh, this is actually a good book you should read if you talk about the construction of national identity. That would be, for instance, Krishan Kumar, The Making of English National Identity. That is always a recommendation if you look at these things, especially at the sort of construction of national identity. Or you have a look at the bibliography of the seminar, if the seminar has something like that. So I know some of my colleagues give a sort of compiled and comprehensive bibliography at the end of the semester or even in the beginning. I usually don't do that, but I have most of the bibliographic entries should be somewhere on the slides. So I do put, the in-text citation and the quote on my slides, so you can use that. You can also use the bibliography in the presentations. So there are a couple of resources you can use just to get started. Sometimes it is always nice to kind of just have 1 or 2 things to read, 1 or 2 articles, and then, go on from there and go on and have a look at sort of one of the main texts, for instance, of the seminar. You can at least find one paper to do that, and sometimes it's also necessary to have a look at the references. So sometimes you find the really important, really nice things in the references of other texts and not so much in the seminar potentially. Or you just kind of go and scour the slope, have one text that you want to look at, and then just kind of have a look right around you. So the book is in this particular shelf, and then you start looking around what's right next to it. So sometimes you can find interesting things there. There are also a couple of online tools you can use, and I think that's on the next slide. So what I did is I looked for one paper, and maybe as a side note, I'm going to be using my own research sort of as an example. Just as a disclaimer, my own research is, of course, something very different. It's a much larger project. It's, of course, a PhD project or a PhD thesis. This is not comparable with term papers. It's much longer, you have much more time, and it's much more stressful, to be fair. But generally, just, the conception phase and the rough steps, these are, of course, the same thing. So I'm going to be using my own research sort of as an exemplification of a certain point or of certain points. And what I've done here is I basically had a look at one paper that is Marion Gott's Sexuality, Sexual Health and Aging. I put it into this online tool, and then it kind of goes through the references and starts linking the references with other texts that are related to it. And that gives you a sort of network of texts that roughly cover the same topic, but that deal with different points. And sometimes that can be still very helpful just to kind of go through these things and have a look what others wrote about it. That doesn't mean that you have to use each and every text, but sometimes it can be actually quite helpful to have a look at related texts. And even if you're not using these texts, might still be quite helpful to have a look at them anyways. So there's that. This is, again, my own stuff. I just have to check. My moderator window has just left the premises, which I always love. Thanks. Not. Anyways, so this is what you've done. So you've read a couple of articles, you have your main text, you have had a look at what you could deal with. This is still established. So how do you go on? Usually what you do is that and this is something, and I said that last week, but I'm going to say that again, because this is one of the most vital steps of your term paper. And I've written it down, the sources and your bibliography are the backbone of term papers. And I know people, weirdly enough, I thought as a student, I really tried to kind of circumvent everything that had to do with academic writing, because I thought, as I go along, I'll figure it out at some point. But usually you don't. If you don't learn it really early, you have a hard time figuring it out. And usually by the time you figure it out, you kind of notice that if I had known that before, all my term papers and presentations would have been so much better in the beginning. So this is something you need to be learning as soon as you can. If you're in the second semester, this is your chance. You still have time to actually learn that, to kind of have all these mechanisms and structures in place for when you actually go onto a larger project, for instance. And this is really, really important to have that down in the first couple of semesters. If you haven't had it down, if you're in your 4th or 6th semester, don't worry. There's still time, but I would urge you to kind of practice these things. So again, bibliography and sources are the backbone of your paper. It's really, really important to keep track of them. So what you really want to do is, first you need to reference not everything you read, but what you certainly need to reference is everything where you really take an argument, where you take, if you really cite something, if you copy paste something into your term paper. I know it sounds really simple, but this is the moment where you should be keeping track of your resources and of your sources. And this is the last thing you want to do, and I think I've given that example last week, but I'm going to give it again because this is one of the worst ways of learning it. When I had to write a term paper on Scottish national identity, and I read literally everything. Obviously I'm overdoing it right here, but I read as much as I could. I read Benedict Anderson and I don't know, what was it again? Eric Hobsbawm and all of the main texts, because I thought, if I have that down, then I can actually really write a proper term paper. And I could. It was brilliant. It wasn't brilliant. I was, in my 5th semester, so none of the term papers you write are truly, truly brilliant works. But I actually had the sources down that I needed. But the problem was that in the end, after I had sort of started to cite and after I had put in all the quotes, I had to go through all my notes because I didn't take proper notes. This is probably one of the things you need to be, again, learning pretty early, how to take proper notes. And I'm going to give you an example in a moment. And this is, again, my own research. So this is something that works for me. But what you need to be figuring out is something that works for you. If it's something like proper handwritten notes for presentations, that's totally fine. Eventually, especially if you get into the range of a bachelor thesis, master thesis, and then state exam, the state exam thesis, then handwritten notes can be a bit difficult. Sometimes it's just it takes a long time, and it's really tough because you can't search your notes for certain quotes. So, make it as simple and as easy to use for you as you can. But this is, again, it is super important that you have that down as soon as you can, because you don't want to go through all your notes without page numbers, for instance, or without a bibliography entry, and then retroactively try to glean where you got all your info from and on which page it was, because that will take a shit ton of time, and it won't endear you to academic writing, because it will make it so much harder than it should be. And what I do usually is I use one specific program called Scrivener, where I put all my notes in it. So each and every paper I read, each and every book I read has its own little document, which you can see on the left-hand side here. So each of these documents is one paper I have read. It always has the name of the writers in it, and it has the title in it, and of course the publishing year. So this is what I also need as as in the in-text citation in this case. And then afterwards and you can see a proper kind of bibliographic entry up there, and then I go through the papers and the books page by page. I put down the number, then I add all my notes for that page, and then I go on to the next page, because that makes it so much easier afterwards. First, I can search through these papers again. I can search my notes, and then I always have the page number already ready. So writing down the in-text citation and eventually writing down the bibliographic entry is actually pretty easy afterwards, because I don't do it afterwards. I do it, during my work in this case. And that took me quite a bit of time to actually get that down. So I didn't do that from the beginning onwards, as the infamous Scottish national identity term paper sort of should have made clear. But after that, I tended to do that simply to make my life as a writer, I wish it was a life as a writer, just to make that a bit more easy for me, and to have not that work in the end, basically. What I also do is I do have and I know that there are a couple of academics that say, don't use, the separate Word document with all the bibliographic entries done in by hand. That is pretty difficult. I still use it because that is how I work best. Every time I read a paper, I put it in an extra document, basically, with all my bibliographic entries, simply to have that ordered already. On the right-hand side, you can see parts of my bibliography for my PhD thesis. It's pretty long, so it has a list of contents to make it easier to put things in. But generally, it's good to have something like that right next to you as you work, so that you can basically put it in as soon as you have it. There are also other ways of doing that. You can use any form of bibliographic or citation manager. There is Mendeley, there's Zotero, there are online tools. You can use whatever suits you best, and this is something you can try. So my advice would be, if I can actually give advice after I've just said that I didn't do that in the beginning, but the best thing you can do is just to have, for each presentation or for each term paper, right in the beginning of your studies, just try out what works for you. So a friend of mine figured out that she could use Mendeley pretty easily. That would be, for instance, something you can try out in one presentation. And if you think, that works well for me, use it for a different presentation also. If you notice something isn't working for me, try out a different tool. And sometimes in the end, you go back to the tool you've used in the beginning. So there are a couple of things you can try out, but you need to be trying them actually out. This is not something you should be doing right at the end of your studies, just when you write your Staatsexamens Arbeit, and then just kind of go, ooh, interesting, now I'm going to try out all the tools. I did that during my bachelor thesis, and it takes a lot of time. Usually you don't have that time when you write the state examination thesis or when you write a bachelor or master thesis. So as soon as you can, try it out. Okay, moving on. Same thing again. I'm not quite sure why you see that twice. Anyways, so again, as I said, important thing is keep track and compile your bibliography as you go along. Again, there are a couple of things you can do. There are web services, citation software, there are analog methods, as I do. There are citation softwares, Mendeley, Zotero, EndNote, Citavi. Some of them are free to use, some of them are paid services. Mostly they have a paid service even if they are free. Just give me a second. There are web services. I think I still need to have a look. Give me a second. I'll just write that down so that I give you the link to the tools. I have listed them in a Padlet basically, so you can access them and have a look. Or basically, and this is again my recommendation for you, or my recommendation for you. Just find something that works for you. I think most of your lecturers, and I know people ask me, or you ask friends, or I think if you look at academic Twitter, there's a huge debate going on about what kind of bibliography and citation manager to use. The thing is, you need to figure something out for you. I can only give you pointers, I can give you recommendations, but you need to figure out what works for you. If any of these things don't work for you, you need to be finding something that is specifically workable for you, that doesn't take a lot of time, that makes your life actually easier, that makes writing a bit easier and doesn't stress you out if you have to think of the bibliography. So there are a couple of things you need to be figuring out on your own. The only thing I can do is to give you recommendations and to give you a kind of glimpse at how I'm doing it or how others are doing it. With regard to the style sheet, because that's usually a question, what kind of citation should we be using, what kind of citation style? I think the accepted standard is the MLA 8 at the moment. This is the latest manual for language and something. But this is something, MLA is just something you can never go wrong with. You can still use the MLA 8 or 9, no, it's the 7, that would also still work, but still try to use the most recent MLA style. It's the easiest thing to do because you usually have a handbook when they put in everything, how to cite tweets, how to cite YouTube videos, how to cite books and papers and whatnot, chapters, lectures, seminars, all of that is in the handbook by the Language Association. So if you want to use something where you really have a guidebook that explains everything in detail, use MLA 8 or use APA 7, for instance, that would also work. It's also used quite often in the humanities and the social science, so both would be totally all right to use. If you want to use something that is more adapted to our standards and our institute, then there is still the style sheet of the institute, which you find both on the webpage the webpage of the Literary Studies Department, the British Culture Studies Department, and I think even linguistics are using it. Not quite sure about that, but at least literary studies and cultural studies are using that style sheet of the institute. You can never go wrong with that. But if you want to have something that, that is kind of applicable in the entire department, so in the entire English and American Studies department, then MLA 8 or APA 7 would be absolutely workable for you. All right, this is so much so on resources and research. Again, we're still pretty much in the pre-writing phase. And now coming to conceptualization. So this is more to do with structure, with how to kind of structure your arguments, how to start writing, how to basically have all the steps in place from where you can actually start writing. So now what you've done, if you follow that kind of step-by-step guide, then you've found your topic, you have already done research, you probably have a bulk of research notes already, you have a pretty alright compiled bibliography already, so what are you going to do now? And, well, As I've said before, it's a very individual step, and there's literally no golden rule to do it. Everyone does that very, very individually. So some do conceptualization by hand, some do conceptualization by simply having a friend as a sounding board, some don't do conceptualizations as such, so sometimes they just have a written Word document where they put a rough structure in, and then they start to fill it with info and with quotes from which the text somehow emerges. Some people have to write or have to open a different document and put all the quotes for the introduction in it, and then all the quotes for the main part, etc., etc. So again, conceptualization, this is something, it's a lot of trial and error. And I know that, our studies don't really give people a lot of room to fail, but sometimes, if it doesn't work, the conceptualization, that is also a pretty interesting thing to figure out, because then you know what works for you and what doesn't. What is important, however, is that you consolidate your notes, kind of go through your notes again and figure out what's most important. And not in the sense of, oh, I really find that interesting. That's not important, but all the points that support your argument. So if going back to the middle class values and the sexual agency of women, then having something about masculinity and about intersex and transsexuality might not exactly be important to your argument. So you need to be really focusing on what your core argument is and what quotes do you need in order to support this argument. So don't go off into a tangent or on a tangent. Don't do as I do, so to speak. That is usually something quite interesting for a footnote, but it's not really necessary for your entire argumentation in this case. So figure out what actually is important for your argument. And then generally start structuring your chapters in a logical way. So each chapter and I'm going to give you an example. Each chapter mirrors the entire structure of the term paper. You always start with a brief introduction, with a brief theoretical framework, and then go into the analyses. All of these things usually mirror one another, so they come up over and over again in this case. And your arguments should be structured from weakest to strongest. I think that's something that even schools do in a way, but you should always start with the argument that is least convincing to you and the reader, and then end off with an argument that is really, really strong. So the last thing I need to remember from your argument or from your term paper needs to be that last statement really was really good. And you can even, I think one of my lecturers told me once that my writing always reads itself like a crime novel. I always go you could say this and you could say that, but you can't because of. So it's something you need to practice in order to really get it down easily. But they should be structured from weakest to strongest in general. All right. Conceptualization is key. So structuring your paper, structuring your arguments in a cohesive and a comprehensive and a logical manner is actually important for both the writing, because you kind of know where you're going, but also in order to convince the reader in this case, and kind of also convince yourself sometimes. So what do I do? And again, one of my examples is that I usually do my conceptualization by hand. I'm just going to show you something that is, I believe, all my notes from 2020 to 2021. Quite a number of notebooks, and I usually have all my conceptualizations, all my ideas and notes on my chapters. I do have them written down, simply because I work best by thinking through pen and paper. But that's something, again, I figured out that I can't really think through chapters if I write them down basically online. So there's that. And again, I also have a longish structure, which is now far longer. That is a Zwischenstand, so to speak, from 2022 in the beginning of the year. But again, I've progressed a bit further. But this is something how I at least plan my time. So this is more of an accountability thing, simply to know where I'm at, what I'm doing at the moment, where I have to go, where my problems lie, etc., etc. So again, this is not something you need to do. I'm just going to give you that, but that's not important. Recently, I also have sort of tried to figure out how to do that, not in written form, simply because I don't want to be lugging around 5 to 50 notebooks all the time. So I have used Notion as a tool, so to speak, in order to kind of structure what I'm doing, when I'm doing it, and how long I still have time, or how long it took me to, for instance, revise a chapter or edit a chapter, etc., etc. Again, this is for a longer project. This is, of course, not necessarily something that is applicable for a 3 to 5 page essay. However, simply to have a rough idea when you're going to do things. I think right in the beginning of my project, I had written down a rough outline of when would I want to do this, that, and the other, and that never really works out. So even because there was one question about, how do I time these things? How do I actually have time to plan 2 to 3 term papers in, 2 months or so? And it always kind of depends on how well you work under pressure. It also kind of always depends on not so much how you work under pressure, but certainly how you structure your time. So if you're, for instance, someone who can work really well in the evening, don't try and kind of have days where you work from, 9 to 12. If that's not your work time, don't work during those times. Do other kinds of work. Do small things, admin, writing emails, structuring things. But if you write really well in the evening, write in the evening. It's just, it sounds very condescending, but it's all about planning, and it's all about having a proper kind of structure of your day. It's pretty hard to do that if you have 2 to 3 term papers to do. Which I also would not recommend. If you need extensions, always ask your lecturer for extensions, because, eventually if you have to write 3 to 4 term papers, longer term papers, that gets really tiring really fast. But most things can be done really well with planning. And if I just go back and go through conceptualization, through that step in depth, and really do a lot of conceptualization in the beginning, that usually helps a lot with the writing. If that step, if the research and the conceptualization is done well, writing will be much easier, because you've done the lion's share of your work has already been done. Unless, of course, you really struggle with conceptualization, then this might simply take longer. So make time for planning, make time for writing, but also, even more important, make time for breaks, make time for doing other stuff instead of university. I think someone wrote down, lecturers kind of think that you don't do anything else but university. We kind of know that you do other things but university. And you need to be making breaks for that. And sometimes it's also all right to say, I can totally do 2 term papers, but I know that I can't do 3. So sometimes it's also a completely valid thing to say, I'm just going to drop 1. Usually that's a bit of negotiation with your examinations office, or just kind of ask for an extension, but usually that's possible. Again, I can't really give you a golden rule when it comes to time management. It's just something you need to be figuring out. Just kind of have a look at, when do you write best? When do you work best? Sometimes people work really well in the morning. Some people work really well in the evening. Just kind of try and figure out when you work best and what works for you, and then kind of try and shift your days to accommodate your writing, so to speak. Before I ramble on, are there any questions, actually? I know that 3 people are still kind of sitting in front of their screens and watching and listening. I'm just going to ask now, are there any questions? Anything I should go back to? Yeah, anything at all. Okay, 4 people. Okay, that does not seem to be the case. This is always the point about live streams. You kind of sit there and you talk a lot. But okay, again, I'm going to watch the chat. But I'm going to move on from conceptualization. Again, this is my list of contents, which is now a bit old-ish. It's still from last year. I kicked out half of it. Anyways, moving on. My timeline, my PhD timeline, and now coming to questions or general rules for academic writing. There's one rule, and I think it's the one that I put in the beginning. That's rule number 1. A good rule of thumb for essays, and I'm just going to read that out, or for presentations, is called the miniskirt rule, which is kind of sexist, but I'm still using it because essays and presentations should be long enough to cover what needs to be covered, but short enough to be interesting. This is something I'm going to say, and I'm going to sound like a hypocrite because I usually tend to overdo my presentations and overdo my term papers and longer, writing projects. But generally, you should include what needs to be included, and it should still be short enough to be interesting. Although, with presentations in particular, it's the 20-minute rule. You shouldn't really overextend over 20 minutes because then it'll get really hard to listen for your audience, or have breaks in it or something like that. But generally, this is for term papers. Again, this is potentially not exactly the thing any longer, simply because we give pretty strict page ranges, but usually that goes together with the idea of sort of structuring your arguments properly and then having all the quotes and the notes you need for that particular argument. And every time you think, oh, that's really interesting, and if it doesn't really fit the bill and doesn't really fit your argument, usually just put it in a footnote. It's interesting. Footnotes are usually for information that are nice to have, but not necessarily necessary, so to speak. Not necessarily necessary. This exactly that. So basically, every time you run into something you find particularly interesting, but that isn't necessary, that's usually where you should place a footnote. Rule number 2 is that something I've already said. So this is basically, the preliminary remarks before you start writing. No matter what you do, keep track of your sources all the times, literally all the times. Never lose track of your sources. And if you do, I hope you catch it early enough, and then you kind of go back. So again, at the end of your term paper, that's not exactly the perfect time to go back through your sources, unless it's a short term paper. But usually try to do that while you write and while you do research. Gathering them afterwards is only more work, and that is usually if you're under pressure, because you'll finish that term paper potentially pretty short before the deadline. Going through your sources, there will be mistakes, but the problem is sources and bibliography are one of the more important parts of your term paper. And each and every semester I say that, and each and every semester I have people kind of nodding along, being pretty aware that this is important. And each semester I get bibliographies where I think, what? Really? Mm-hmm. I mean, I can't show you any, unfortunately, or fortunately, but really this is an important step. And we usually, academic writing isn't proper academic writing if the bibliography isn't there, if the bibliography looks like shit, if the bibliography is not alphabetically ordered, if the bibliography, for instance, includes Wikipedia. It should never, ever include Wikipedia. It should never, ever include things like Spark Notes, study edu things. Every time you have something where someone has done the work for you, in the sense of study notes, Spark Notes, etc., don't put it in your bibliography. Use the references. Even Wikipedia has references down below. Use them. Don't use the article itself. You can usually use Wikipedia as an overview for yourself, but don't cite it, don't quote it, don't put it in your bibliography. Also, just a link in your bibliography isn't a proper bibliographic entry. It needs an author, a year, a page, and then the link, and not, all of it kind of jumbled in. That is why we usually recommend the style sheet of the Institute, or MLA 8 or APA 7, simply that you have a guideline on how to do that, so you're not left alone. And if you use citation managers, that's even easier for you, because you simply put in all the data and it spits out a proper citation a bibliographic entry for you in this case. Rule number 3, if you're not using MLA or a style sheet, use one style consistently. Don't use MLA on the first page and APA on the second and then the style sheet on the rest. Use one and use it consistently throughout the entire paper. Same goes for presentations. So these rules are usually also something you can definitely look for in presentations. Don't use dozens of styles, use one. Do not vary. That's why I put it in short. And rule number 4, and that is something that usually people don't have time for, and this might not be so much of a problem for shirt term papers. Yeah, I was totally still, my brain was still caught up on the mini skirt in this case. But usually you're pretty short on time, or I usually as a student was pretty short on time when I finished up my term papers and presentations, but it's really vital to have someone proofread, especially if it's longer papers. Maybe not the case for a 3 to 5 page essay, but if you get in the range of 12 to 15, 20 to 25, then proofreading is actually a really good thing and should definitely be done. So look for a friend, that sounds weird, but have a friend or have one of your co-students and just ask them, if you trust them with your writing, just ask them, can you just look through it? Can you just tell me, is it, does it make sense? Is the citation all right, etc., etc.? Because eventually you'll be, as you say, betriebsblind, you won't be able to see these mistakes. So having someone else look over it and just tell you, that doesn't make sense, or I find that argument not really satisfying or not really convincing. This really, really helps. So again, have someone proofread if you can. But that always means that you have to be done a bit earlier than a couple of hours before deadline. All right, just moving on. Questions of writing. There are a couple of general rules for writing. So first of all is that if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. That's usually the case. Some people will run into writer's block where you simply can't write. Even I have that. Sometimes I can't write. It's not even having something to do with motivation or not wanting to write, but sometimes it really, really doesn't work. But writing is a bit like, like turning on the water. And if your faucet isn't working, you need to turn it on anyways. So it drips very slowly, but eventually, it'll work perfectly. You just need to give it a bit of time. So sometimes you just need to wait. Sometimes that means just doing one or having one day off and not writing. Sometimes it means that you write one sentence. Don't give yourself any super weird out there goals. Don't tell yourself, this day I want to write 5 pages. If you're not someone who can crank out 5 pages a day, this will be super demotivating if you tell yourself, you need to be cranking out that much pages or that much words or something. Sometimes it's pretty much enough to say, I want to write 1 sentence one day. If you write more than 1 sentence, you've overfulfilled your daily goal. Sometimes, days will be really good and you can write 2 to 3 pages. Sometimes days will be really bad and you can only write potentially 1 sentence. But don't give yourself any goals you can't fulfill. So always work within your own sort of capacities. If you're someone who can write a lot in a day, then set yourself the 1-page range. For instance, tell yourself, I'm going to write a half a page or 1 page. And if you fulfill that, everything that goes beyond that is brilliant, but you don't need to. And sometimes that half a page will take a day. And sometimes that half a page will take an hour. Very different. But if it doesn't work a day, then don't fret about it. It happens. That's totally all right. The next day will usually be better. And if it doesn't work the next day, just take a little break. Sometimes that helps. Or talk to somebody, talk to a friend about it. Sometimes even that helps, to have a sounding board where you can just kind of bounce off ideas. Usually that helped me in this case. Also, if it doesn't really work, reconceptualize your chapters, go through your structure, go through problems with your structure. Sometimes that has something to do with logical arguments. So also as a personal example from my own writing at the moment, I have written a 50-page chapter I kind of knew something didn't really work. I really cranked out those 50 pages and I wasn't really happy with it. So right now I'm noticing that there are some structural problems actually, which is why the writing didn't really work, simply because my brain couldn't say, oh, this follows that and this is logical. So if I write this, this has to follow. So really have yourself a proper map of your paper, and then writing will usually be much easier. And if it doesn't work, sometimes there might be a structural problem or an argumentative problem or a problem concerning your topic. So always kind of go back to conceptualization, which is why usually conceptualization and writing kind of work right next to each other. So sometimes conceptualization goes hand in hand with writing and vice versa. And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got from one of my lecturers was, what you understand, you can express. So the moment you know what you're talking about and the moment you're actually convinced by what you're talking about, writing will be so much easier. Because you know what you're talking about and you know that you can express it. So having understood theoretical concepts is actually sometimes vital in order to write your term paper, which is why I also recommend that even though people kind of throw around things like post-structuralism or post-modernism or social constructivism and all of these things, if you have no idea what these terms mean, don't use them. Simple as that. If you want to write about gender theory and you haven't really understood performativity, really think about whether you want to use that term, because you will need to explain it. And usually if you use it, because theory isn't something that sits in the front of your paper or somewhere in the beginning of it and then you never use it, theory is always a tool you use in order to explain the text, in order to work with the text, in order to get, on that second level, the level beyond representation within the text. So if you're using that and you notice that you haven't really understood a concept, either have a look if you can find a different concept that works much better for you, or leave it out. Because if you use it in your analyses and we notice that and we will notice definitely if you've understood your theory and your theoretical concepts, simply don't use it. Don't lobby or don't, throw around words that you barely have any idea about. So if you reference, for instance, and people sometimes do that, they reference Marxism and neoliberalism, and you kind of glean from the way they write that they might not be too familiar with the terms. So even if it's in some other theory or in some other writing, if you don't really get what they mean, leave it out. Don't open yourself up for criticism simply because you haven't really gotten behind a theoretical concept. And it's totally fine. You can't understand it all, but use what you understand and what you can actually use because you understand it. Also, keep your writing simple and formal, and I think we'll get to that in a moment. When it comes to writing, there are a couple of comments on writing itself, so keep it simple but formal. Please don't use things like, in my opinion, I think, I like, etc., etc. That is not exactly formal writing. That is usually informal writing, and it's very, very problematic. And I think it'll be on the slide in a moment. So generally, keep a consistent style that needs to be appropriate for academic writing. So that is, and I'm just going to switch off the camera for a sec, that is, you shouldn't be using informal language. So things like, for instance. So like, I think this is that. Doesn't work. Also, don't use things like bromance. What else did I read recently? It was something about Arctic voyaging, and they went up north and just chilled there for a second. Not exactly the perfect way of writing that. So try to keep it as academic as possible. I know it's really tough to do that, but if you read research papers and if you read books on academic topics, you kind of already have a pretty good direction how you should be writing. Also, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be using things like I. For instance, in the thesis statements I gave you, I specifically wrote down in this paper, I want to show that, or in this paper, I will argue that. That's totally fine. But you use it in conjunction with I want to argue. I will do that. Totally all right. Don't use it. Don't overuse it. Don't use it in every second sentence. But sometimes, stating specifically what you want to do is a good thing. But don't use things like, in my opinion. That's completely different. What we usually evaluate isn't your opinion, it's your arguments. Of course, it has something to do with your opinion, but the moment you state, in my opinion, I cannot really evaluate that because that's your personal opinion. How am I supposed to judge that or to mark it? So try to not use, in my opinion. Don't use, I feel, I think. These are very personal things that we don't want to read in an academic paper. Also avoid colloquial abbreviations like shouldn't, hadn't, won't, I'm, will, he has, he's, something like that. That doesn't work. Always write it out. Use should not, had not, will not, I am, etc., etc. Also avoid abstract terms and wordy expressions, but be specific as you can. Don't use, don't go into or what people also write, if you could or one could argue that potentially this is far too much, potentially could this, that, the other. State very plainly what you want to do. I will argue. One can argue. One argues. These kinds of things. Use active language. Don't use passive constructions where you really completely obscure what you actually mean. Generally, be specific as possible. Be as specific as possible. Also, avoid stating your own opinion. I already said that. Plainly, like evaluating concepts. I judge this to be stupid. This is something you can say, if you're in a seminar, but the moment you really want to argue something, you really want to convince your reader, this is not convincing. Your own opinion, to be frank, isn't convincing, but arguments that are logically structured, that is convincing. So, in my opinion, I think, I feel, etc. You don't feel, you argue. You don't think, you don't. It's not your opinion, it's your argument. And this needs to be stressed in your term papers. Avoid using informal words like big or good, like weak words in this case. We make this, not like that. It makes England into that, this and the other. It constructs England. So try to use synonyms for these weak words in this case. Okay. Also, avoid using many phrasal verbs like give up or put off. These are too informal. Sometimes they can be used for a certain effect, but try to circumvent them if you can. Also, avoid using some vague words with too many possible meanings like thing or get. I always love it if I have a paper and they did that thing. What thing? What are they doing? Or the films do that thing where they do this. No. Don't write like that. Don't use thing. If you can prevent it, don't use it. If it's a thing, like an object, fine, use it. But generally people don't use thing. They use very colloquial and very informal ways of people often write as if they are speaking to me, which is sometimes quite nice, but it's not really appropriate for academic writing. Also don't use emotive words like fantastic or terrible or horrific. Usually these words will get a kind of an underline, and then I'll write next to it judgmental or evaluative or something like that. So usually you give a certain impression, but these are not academically appropriate words. Sometimes they're being used in a quote, leave it like that. But if you want to state that something is fantastic, something is particularly interesting, something is particularly significant, something is terrible, something is particularly problematic or particularly ambiguous or particularly complicated. It's always about kind of balancing out. So you don't have incredible emotions in academic writing, you don't have something that is incredible, and you don't have something that is completely terrible, but you try to level out these these highly emotive words in this case, or high emotions basically. There's always just a balanced level, and everything is generally problematic, complicated, significant, important, has an impact, these kinds of things. Also, use a thesaurus, use synonyms. There are a couple of pages that actually where you just put in the word you're looking for a synonym for, and then they spit out an entire list of synonyms. Make your own writing a bit easier on your own for yourself, and just kind of use these web tools, for instance. Then avoid passive conjunctive phrases. That's what I said, One could potentially argue then that this may be so. A bit too much may, could, potentially. Either it is, it's like Yoda. There is no try, there's only do. So there's no passive conjunctive phrases. There's only an argument. There's only a clearly formulated argument, and that's something you need to be doing. Moving on with flowery language. You don't need to be writing like Goethe in the 19th century. Potentially, you shouldn't be writing that. You're not Geoffrey Chaucer. You're not writing for a specific audience. You're writing an academic paper. So if it sounds like a novel and you've been using a lot of metaphors, then know your audience. It's not exactly, you're not writing a novel, unfortunately. It's usually lovely to read, but it's always a bit problematic, or you can doubt whether that's actually appropriate concerning academic writing. So try to avoid that. Sometimes you can use it to a certain effect. Introduction or conclusion is always a good place to use that, but generally in your main argument, you should avoid using too flowery language. Okay, then concerning italics and footnotes, I've said already something about it. Sometimes people use italics or bold text or underlining for highlighting words. Don't do that. Italics are used for book titles, for works, for television series, for films, and that should be the only points where you use italics. So italics only titles of books, movies, papers, etc., as well as foreign words if you discuss the term, but don't use it to highlight words. Also, don't use bold text. Don't underline things unless it's a headline. But in the text, there is no highlighting, there's no emphasis as that. Also, footnotes should be used for important additions and annotations to the text. So every time you think, that's important, but it's not really part of my argument, that is where you should go and put it in a footnote, for instance. They are sometimes significant and vital in order to understand the text, but they are not necessarily important for the argument, or they would really interrupt the flow of the text. So sometimes footnotes are a nice but unnecessary, or a nice and necessary but doesn't really fit in the flow. So if you have a particular argument on, for instance, the objectification of women, then having a footnote on the objectification of men and why this doesn't really work out, for instance, would be a good footnote. It doesn't really fit in the text. It's part of the argument, but it doesn't really fit. You could put that in a footnote in this case. Again, I'm going to ask because I have to actually take a sip of my drink, but are there any questions so far? Because I've been rambling on for about over an hour, I think, and I'm not quite sure whether people are still following or whether they've just kind of gone and thought, can't, don't, want to, whatever. So are there any questions? That does not seem to be the case. Oh, no questions for me. Good. Then I'll just ramble on. I'm also wondering whether people will go back to this and go, oh yeah, you know what? In 2-hour live stream on academic writing, this is going to be really interesting. Anyways, but now I have a video potentially out there which I can reference and say, you know what, if you want to learn more, there's the live stream on it. Anyways, I'm just imagining if I would have put that on Twitch, if people would just kind of switch it off. Anyways, moving on. The introduction. This is where people really have problems with, and I'm just going to switch off my camera for a sec so that you can actually read it. I'm going to leave it on for about a minute. that people can actually read it if you switch on later. These are 2 introductions. I'm not going to read them out, but I'm going to go through them in a minute just to kind of explain why one is good and one isn't. If you read through them, you kind of already know that the cadence and the flow is a bit different. I'm going to switch off my mic in a sec, but just kind of very briefly read through it, and I'm going to go through them one by one in a minute. All right, and here we are back again, also with the camera. Okay, if you need more time, just kind of go back a second or so, and then pause it, and then go back to where I actually start explaining. So I'm going to go through the first introduction. Generally, maybe very generally, this introduction isn't bad per se. It is very long, it is very convoluted, and it has some problems which I'm going to address in a moment. So first of all, there is still a source missing. The very fact that this division constantly reappears in virtually the same form would suffice to indicate. This needs to be explained. So there should be a citation, an in-text citation somewhere where you got this info from. If you don't do that, then this is, in German, it's eine Behauptung. That cannot be proven. You haven't given me any reference. I can't really check if that's truly the case, but there would be that a reference would be missing. A source needs to be given at this point. So there is an in-text citation reference missing. Generally, these are 2 sentences, far too long. I think the source, one is 7 lines and the one other is 11 lines. That's too long. I shouldn't be saying that, but that's too long. If your sentence runs over 3 lines, then you should be looking at if you can actually shorten it. So if it exceeds 3 lines, your sentence is usually too long. Also, having multiple sentences simply separated with a, what's it called, a semicolon, a dash or something. Not quite sure what it is in English. Anyways, you know what it is. You know what I mean. So if that's the case, it's you can use this kind of punctuation, but if the sentence overextends 3 lines, it's too long. And I do want to know what I have read in the beginning once I get to the end of the sentence. And, with the second sentence, even I have trouble following it. And the problem is, the more convoluted your sentences are, the less chance do I have to actually follow what you are trying to say there. So try to keep your sentences short. Try to vary sentences. So if I have 2 sentences, one is 7 lines, the other one is 11 lines, following straight one another, it's very difficult to read in this case. Also, the last part, this presupposes a critical objectification of the epistemological and social conditions that make possible both a reflexive return to the subjective experience of the world and also the objectification of the objective conditions of that experience. This is an incredibly confusing sentence. The structure is very tough. Also, I don't quite know where you want to go for, what you want to go for, what's the goal of your or of your text. None of that becomes clear from the introduction alone. And this is not what an introduction should be. An introduction should make clear what do you want to do, how you're going to do it, so methodology, for instance, and which text you're using, and why you're using it. So if you're using Lady Chatterley's Lover, then at least one sentence is to the effect of, it is particularly significant because blah. That should definitely be in your introduction. And this introduction, of course, a completely different topic, doesn't do any of that. Maybe also because I said you don't use words you don't quite know what to do with. Things like epistemological something. These are, for instance, words that you either need to explain or that you should leave out, unless you definitely know how to work with these terminology. But if you don't, just try to prevent them if you can. Of course, it sounds always very fancy and very proper and very academic, but if you don't really know how to use these terms, or if you're just slightly unsure, perhaps just leave them out. So there's that. This introduction doesn't really fulfill all the aims of an introduction. Again, switching off my camera. The sentences are too long and grammatically far too complex. The sources are completely missing from the text, so there's no reference whatsoever in there. So, and this creates a sort of a long line of assumptions about, a text, or about scientific, the state of scientific research, for instance, but it doesn't give me a reference where I can find these references, where can I find the proof for this assumption. All of that is simply a long line of assumptions, but nothing can be proven, so that's very difficult. Also, the vocabulary makes it really hard to actually understand what the author wants and what he or she is trying to accomplish. It's unclear what the text will be about. It's unclear what texts he/she will be using. There's no clear objective. There's no thesis statement. There's no methodology. There is nothing. So basically, it doesn't really fulfill the aims of an introduction. Also, the parentheses and the copious amounts of comma do not structure the sentence properly or make them more comprehensible. So just because you have another short comment within your sentence, that doesn't make your sentences more understandable. It makes them more convoluted and more problematic. So it's not, sentences should follow a certain structure. They're not a sort of a long line of textual elements that you simply put together. However, the beginning is pretty good. It is interesting, at least in my opinion. It is usually pretty interesting enough to capture my attention. The language is very formal, so that's a very high level of academic writing. Not exactly something you should aspire to, but something that people use. So this is really, I'm saying in really huge inverted commas. You can't see them because I have my camera switched off, but I've been doing the inverted commas kind of thing. It's very, very, very appropriate and very formal. This is not the level a student should go for. Just go for something a little lower than that. The dynamic of the text is also pretty good, and the language is good for an academic text. So there are a couple of things that this introduction does well, but mostly it's not exactly doing its job. Concerning the second introduction, I'm just going to go through it. So the hook could be much stronger. So the start is a bit weak. It basically really tells you what it does, why it does it, and what the main argument is. So that's pretty good, but it could be stronger. You could be opening with a quote, with a question, something else. Then it sort of has the I'm saying appropriate structure. So it starts off with a hook that kind of draws the reader in. Then it basically tells you what it's using. It's using television series. How do television series work? And then it goes on and just kind of tells you what texts it is based on. So this is the choice of material and the reasons that legitimizes the choice of material. And of course, in the end, you have the clear thesis statement, or the statements, this paper examines the practices and mechanisms of the sitcom in order to enable or contain blah. All of these things, that is your thesis statement. This is what the text will do, and this already gives you the structure and the map, so to speak, of the paper. And that's the sort of the aim of the paper. So that is what the introduction does, not particularly well, but does a bit better. However, there are also sources missing. So some of these things, like often paired with badly and mischievous behaving leads, I would like to have a source for that. Where can we find the same structures? Where can we find the same characters, etc., etc. So again, there is something missing, but it's not as bad, so to speak, as in the other one. Still, sources should be added to this. Let me just go on and switch off the camera again. So what the introduction should include is a hook. That is something that engages your readers, on the left-hand side in orange. Your thesis statement or your question, that is what has been written here in green. That's your thesis statement or your main research question, namely, how does it do that? How do these things function in a certain framework? It should also include the political, cultural, social, or general relevance of your topic. Again, I'm interested in is not sufficient in this case, but there should be, and you can see that on the right-hand side, television series reproduce, legitimize, transform, and deconstruct stereotypical notions of age, gender, and sexuality through serial format and through the unique use of laughter and humor. And they're not necessarily bogged down by pervasive asexual, hypersexual divides. So this is, for instance, the potential or the possibilities of destabilization, for instance. That is the cultural and social relevance of your topic. Why am I looking at it? This is the relevance. Also, what do you want to achieve and why? Again, goes more into the direction of what's written in green. This is sort of your thesis statement, the question. Why do you want to achieve it? Simply because films, television does do this, that, and the other. Also, which research has been conducted in this field. So this is, of course, not something you can read on the right-hand side, but usually it's good to have a very brief overview, especially in longer essays and term papers, to have a very brief overview of what is the state of research. So if you write on retirement homes, it might be quite interesting to have a look at what has been done on retirement homes already. Or if you work on heritage films, might be interesting to have a brief look at what are the main texts in heritage film studies, for instance. Also, the choice of your text should be highlighted, so both in terms of the real text, basically based on a selection of British sitcoms, and then the three sitcoms of this paper, but also why you're choosing that. Usually that should feature in your introduction, but at least you should be stating which text you're looking at. So do tell me if you're going to be looking at a film, at a television series, or at a book. That's important. The choice of your text should feature in it. How does this serve the purpose of the paper, for instance, should also be part of it. What specific circumstances do you need to keep in mind? All of these things do feature in your introduction. The outline of your paper or your presentation should also be there. So usually it's easy to say, I will do this first, then I'll do that, and then I'll do this. Doesn't need to be really long, very brief overview of what you're going to do. And then note, every paper needs an aim, something that is to be analyzed, proven, or disproven. And this is exactly what, what's written in green actually does. Particular attention will be paid to intersections. This is what it will do. It will examine the practices and mechanisms of sitcoms. And this is something that you can analyze, something you can trace, something you can actually prove or disprove. So these are the features that not every sitcom, but every introduction should at some point include. Okay, moving on. The main part. And if I look at the time, I've been rambling a lot about the beginning of a term paper, but not so much about the rest of it. Anyways, moving on. Best part to do is to start off with the theoretical framework. Basically, if you analyze a film according to its construction of national identity, perhaps just start with what is identity, what is national identity, how is it constructed, and then move on to the application of your work. Without the theoretical framework, a text or a paper is not complete. Again, these things are sort of your tools. It's basically your toolbox that you're using in order to analyze a certain text. So you'll be using the terminology, you'll be using certain phrases, you'll be tracing certain trends, and this is where you need the theoretical framework for it. And I think I also have that's on the right hand side. You can again see one of basically the list of contents of my current, camera is still in the way, of my current project, and I start with the introduction where I have actually sort of put in what I'm doing, namely what are my theoretical frameworks, age, sexuality, and sexuality on screen, because I'm going to look at age, sexuality, and television series, so having these three things eventually together is important. Then it's material and aims where I explain these things, and then I go off and on, basically, with talking about what is a sitcom, what is humor, what is sexuality and seriality. So this is my theoretical framework. And only if I have established and sort of laid the basis for the rest of it, I can actually start and analyze, because then I have all the terminology ready. I have everything sort of set in place. It's really setting the stage what you do in the first 2 chapters. And this is where you go on. So after you've established what you're going to look at, what your working definitions of certain things is or are, and this is where you kind of go on and actually analyze things and actually write about the text you're looking at. So all the terminology needs to be framed in the beginning, and that forms the basis that you can always go back to. So you don't need to write everything in your theoretical sort of framework, but write as much as you need so that you can actually have an analysis afterwards. So this is basically the theoretical framework I'm using. And then each chapter, and this is what I said in the beginning with the mirroring within each chapter has a very brief theoretical comment already. Again, this is a larger project. It's not appropriate for 3 to 5 page essays, but generally there's always a bit of theory in order to go on with the analyses in this case. Then follow follow a Lear, King Lear potentially. Anyways, follow a clear, coherent line of arguments with an external audience that an external audience is able to follow. So I think there is this rule of thumb: always write for someone who has no fucking idea about your topic. Maybe don't include fucking, but generally it's always about explain that topic to someone as fully as you can. And this is where theory is actually important, because they need to know the terminology in order to understand your analysis. So always write with someone in mind who has no idea about this very topic. So you're explaining something not only to yourself sometimes, but also to a potential other audience. And again, start from weakest to strongest. Also cluster each idea in its own paragraph and expand on it by supporting facts and arguments with details and examples. So if you write about, let's take the national identity example. If you write about national identity, don't say, the text does this. So the text constructs, we used Kingsman and Hot Fuzz and so on. Don't say, Hot Fuzz constructs Englishness by using rural England, or by using pictures of a rural England, in particular this sort of garden culture. That is not enough, because you need to be telling me Hot Fuzz uses, for instance, different pictures of rural England. It uses in, minute 5, second 3 until minute 7, second 4. It uses this particular image in order to support that construction of Englishness. And then it moves on and uses that image of English, or that image of England, to support that construction of Englishness. So you always need to be working with the text. Sometimes you can even work against the text. Also, that would be possible. But generally, you need to provide examples of the text. And I'm actually really thinking of just giving you one of my former term papers and simply providing it as a blueprint of, that people can have a look at how you write these things, because I think that might be actually helpful to have an example. But I'm not quite sure if I'm allowed to do that. But one of the best examples would be look at just, again, whatever you write about, look at articles that are written about it. So don't go for books if you do research, for instance. Usually go for journal articles. Not only are they much shorter, but they usually condense these things in a manner that you can A, follow pretty well, and B, that also gives you a kind of idea on how to do analyses, for instance. So that might be actually helpful. Also avoid deviations. That's the point with footnotes. Every time you veer off your main argument, either you are very good and can go back after one of these side notes, or you veer off completely. And just in order to prevent that, try to put everything that's nice but unnecessary in a footnote. So if you consider an aside important, place it in a footnote. Okay, and cite your sources. I'm going to say that very often in the following part. I'm going to say cite your sources, basically. I could have put it on each and every slide, basically, because I'm really harping on about it, and I will harp on about it for as long as I live, potentially, or at least for as long as I teach. Because again, this is really, really, really important, and I'm definitely going to mark down people that do not put citations and in-text citations in it. So this is part of your evaluation. If you want to have a good mark, you know, being very well versed in the general Handwerk, so to speak, and the general tools of academic writing like citation and research is actually pretty vital. Okay, moving on, the conclusion. For a second, I want to say, a conclusion should conclude. That is still, I think, is one of the things I'm going to say on that slide. But generally, a conclusion is not a summary. As I said, it's not a summary. Summarize your findings. You can summarize your findings very quickly, but then you need to go one step beyond. It's not enough to say it does that. Or if you compare two films and you say both films construct Englishness along the lines of rural England. That's a summary, but that's not a conclusion. It's only part of a conclusion. An overall conclusion is something a bit more, because it says not only they do that, both of them do that. A step further would be they are thus part of a broader discourse on Englishness and the construction of Englishness through images of rurality, for instance. That would be a conclusion that goes a step further, and it's not just a summary. You can also refer back to the question of the beginning. You know, you said in the beginning, I wanted to examine how Englishness is constructed through this. And then you can go back and say, you know, from these two films, it's of course not a conclusive thing, but from these two films, we can glean that, yes, Englishness is still very much constructed through images of a green and pleasant land, for instance. You can also say, you know, what does that mean for other films? You can also kind of put in a reference to another film you've seen that also does the same thing, or that contends with it or breaks with it. You can also say, you know what, these films are actually so simple and they really boil down England to this rural image, which isn't appropriate any longer simply because of industrialization, urban centers, etc., etc. So this would also be part of a conclusion. If you go back to a question, the question is, can you prove it, disprove it? If it's a hypothesis, were there new insights? Is there anything else that you should consider for further investigation? So sometimes you can say, you know what, rurality is a big part, but industrialization is also a big part. However, this would be, you know, something for a different term paper, or I would have to restructure that paper. You can actually comment on your own paper. Don't say, oh, my paper was shit or anything. Not like that. Not a comment like that. But you can certainly say, for instance, such an analysis as I have done is certainly fruitful, but if you don't include this, that, and the other, it could be, you know, it could be much better, or further investigation is needed on these points. So this is something you can include in a conclusion. Also, never include new theories or ideas in a conclusion. So it should always be focused on your topic. You can give a future outlook, for instance, or something that other people could do, but that isn't including new ideas. You shouldn't suddenly go, you know, I've analyzed rurality, but you know what we really interested? The Royal Navy. This would be brilliant. This should not feature in your conclusion unless it has something to do with the text you've analyzed. But then again, be very careful with veering off into some weird asides concerning your texts, for instance. So stick with what you've analyzed. What else is there? Oh yes, so I think that's always a good part if I say that. Exactly, I think that's part of the thesis statement I've given. So based on a selection of British sitcoms, in this case Waiting for God, Brighton, Bells and Wishes, this paper examines the practices and mechanisms sitcoms employ in order to enable and contain representations of later life sexuality by, for instance, couching transgressive, there's a comma missing, anyways, couching transgressive portrayals of sexuality, active older adults in comedic terms, or by containing older adults in rigid heteronormative structures. Please excuse the very odd English grammar, but that's, again, you don't need to be reading that in too close detail. Also, why didn't I spot that? Anyways, And the conclusion would then feature points like, I would explore in the paper generally how this is done individually. I could also do that. Usually you go individually. If you have 3 series, you say, Waiting for God does that, Brighton Bells does that, Vicious does that. And in the conclusion, you kind of sum it up to a certain extent. You say, each series, for instance, proposes, and here you need to just believe me that all of these series do that. Each series proposes that marriage is a vital step towards later life sexuality and continuous later life sexuality. Again, this is kind of a summary, but it's also a conclusion. One does so by marriage and class, one homosexuality, one by marriage and class. So these are common features that you can compare. So in comparison, they all do that particularly well, but they also do it very differently, namely through intersections of class, gender, homosexuality, etc. Also, you can summarize findings. All use marriage, all use class and space in similar ways. Sexuality is similarly portrayed, very transgressive, through supporting characters. So these are structural elements that all series show. But then you would go on and you would draw those findings together and conclude. And you would say, humor has a double role. It's very ambivalent. So every time humor is added, it kind of enables and contains. It makes all of them unreliable narrators. It excludes and includes. So by laughing at people, you exclude certain people and you laugh with a certain social norm, for instance. All of these series kind of uphold a status quo, namely at the end of the season, they all go back to spot one, basically, where they started off with. They can be seen as, or these kinds of mechanisms, humor, status quo, and so on and so forth, can be seen as general mechanisms, and they are often maybe even applicable for all sitcoms. So all sitcoms use gender and cliched gender portrayals. For instance, all of them use cliched portrayals with regard to class. So every time it's middle class. So that always kind of tells you what sitcoms can do and what they can't. And then you could also say, there's more research needed simply because Vicious, for instance, is about a queer or a gay couple. So there's, of course, more research needed on how they enable and contain sexuality, for instance. This would be a conclusion, a very rough one, only in bullet points, but this is something you draw from this text or from these texts. Aftermaths. And maybe, again, just any questions so far? There are just three people watching, so not quite sure. The comment section will be open, and I'll get a notification eventually if someone has a question. So I'm just going to go on. So after you've written everything, you've conceptualized it, you've done research, you've written the entire thing, someone has read it. What comes next? Read your own work. So, going back to this example, I didn't read the conclusion and the sort of the highlighted text, so would have been better to read it again. So simply to spot mistakes, that's always a good thing. Leave it on your desk for 2 to 3 days if you have those days, and then read it afterwards, because then you might be actually able to spot some of the problems already. Also, even better, get someone else to read it. So people can usually spot structural problems much better than you. I think for my PhD thesis, a friend of mine is currently reading it, and she has found some things that don't quite work, and I'm really, really grateful that she has, because I didn't see them any longer. And sometimes after someone else has read through it, you kind of already see mistakes again, so that might be quite good. And we're not talking about typos, but we are talking about structural elements, things that do not work, that you might not have spotted, but others, with fresh eyes can definitely spot. Also, do the last bit of formatting, see the style sheet. So there's a pretty clear framework on the style sheet. All term papers should have a 2 centimeter to 2.5 centimeter frame, margin. There should be page numbers on it. Your name should be in the header. What else? I think font size should be 10.5 if it's Open Sans. If it's Arial, it should be 10 also 10.5, I believe. If it's Times New Roman, should be 12. Use a readable font. Don't use Comic Sans or Papyrus or whatever. Don't simply stick with, even stick with the regular fonts like Calibri or Cambria, everything that Word uses, but have it in 10.5 to 12, depending on how big the fonts are. So that's that. But usually you find the most important part, or the most important formatting guidelines, you find that on the style sheet already. I also will upload in both OPAL courses my style sheet. I have compiled a style sheet basically that you can use. Concerning the bibliography and how do I cite, so if you have, you can barely see anything because I'm right in front of it. So just to have a sort of example, as one of the boldest social thinkers of his generation, Richard Sennett published the book Respect, the Formation of Character in an Age of Inequality, in which he examines the forces that erode respect in modern society. The book was published by Penguin Books in London in 2003. If you want to form a bibliographic entry, so maybe I'm just going to, again, if you want to figure it out, stop here, go through that text and try to come up with your own bibliographic entry. And if you don't do that, I'm just going to go on. You can still stop and go through it. Anyways, moving on. So that is what information, which kind of information do you need for the bibliographic entry? So first thing is name of the author, the title, the edition used, the number of volumes, the city of the publication, the publisher, the year of publication, and the medium of publication. That is only important if it's a TV series or a film or something. So what do we find in this brief abstract? We find most of these things. So we have the name of the author, the title, the publisher, the city of publication, and the year of publication. And this is something you then kind of rearrange if you have it in one of these texts. But usually you find that in the beginning of a book. Do I have a book right here? But usually there's where they put in who has set it and who the layouting and formatting people were. This is where you find all these info. And a bibliographic entry would look something like this. Is always last name, comma, first name. If it's a second author, it's last name, comma, first name of the first author, and first name, last name of the second author. So if I publish a paper with Martin Eichhorn, it would be Eichhorn, Martin, and Franziska Röber. And then the year. So this is how you do that. And in this case, it's Sennett, Richard. It's 2003 in the beginning. Respect, again, in italics. Always try to make sure that book titles are put in italics. Then it's London, colon, and Penguin Books. So this would be the bibliographic entry. If you want to use it in a text, you could write, Sennett argues that their temporary poverty did not carry the same stigma it might have inflicted on many of our white neighbors. That would be 2003, 120. 120 is the page number in this case, and you would not use Sennett in the in-text citation simply because you've put the name of the author in the beginning. If you use the name of the author for the first time in a term paper, for instance, you would write Richard Sennett, and in all other instances it is only Sennett argues this, that, and the other, and then you would not use it in the parentheses. However, if you don't use the name in the text, basically in the same sentence, the in-text citation should also be here somewhere, but it isn't. Oh, it stopped. I accidentally clicked on something completely different. That's always a good thing. For a second, I thought, oh my God, it's not working any longer. But no, I was just intelligent enough to press stop. What a surprise that it did stop. Anyways, what is going on, honestly? So this is not what I wanted. Brilliant. What is it doing actually? So yeah, now it should work again. Not quite sure. Oh wait. it's the end of the presentation. So I'm going to very briefly show you what it would be if Sennett isn't. So if it's, for instance, he argues that they're temporary poverty, blah, 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 it would be Sennett 2003, 120. So what you do is this, and I'm just going to, now it should be on the, yeah, exactly. So he argues that, etc., etc., and then it's Sennett 2003, 120. So that would be that. That would be the last step of the bibliography. Again, I'm going to upload a rough style sheet of what you have to do and how you do it with different formats, like if it's a paper, if it's an edited volume, if it's a, I think also have film and television series. So the most common forms, I'm going to put that in this sort of style sheet again, and I'm going to upload that on OPAL. The only thing you need to be doing is to be proactive, so to speak, and have a look at it yourself. You can always use that. You can use that consecutively throughout your studies. We all use roughly the same things. Again, if you have questions concerning that, first step would be to look at the MLA guide and just to figure out which one you actually want to work with and which one is comfortable for you to use. I know there were a couple of other questions concerning things like Thesenpapier, presentations, etc., etc. I think if I have the time, I might be doing some kind of Alexander Lasch-like essentials for presentations and for Thesenpapiere and all of these things. But this would be so far for academic writing. Again, are there any questions? This would be, this is your chance. Ask anything, everything, whatever you want concerning academic writing. I'm just going to give you a second and very briefly switch off my mic. I mean, I don't mind that you don't have questions. I'm just, waiting for a sec. I mean, again, if you have any questions, that is for those of you that are going to watch this after the deal is done, so to speak. You can kind of just write them in the comment section. Again, I might be publishing some kind of essential simply to have all those info out. Usually we have most of the info on the web pages of our institutes. Also, your lecturers will probably be nice enough to give you a sort of pointer where you can find these sorts of style sheet, etc., etc. Again, if you have any questions, just kind of drop them in the comment section. I'm going to answer them. I'm going to go through them. Other than that, I'm still available on Discord. If there are any questions, please feel free to do so. I know it's always a bit awkward to ask your lecturers for pointers and tips and tricks, but if there's anything I can do concerning that, I'm totally willing to do that. Or if you want to write an email with sort of other questions, then also that would be totally all right. I'm going to answer that. Just might take a while, but yeah. I'm going to stick around for a couple of more minutes and wait if there are any questions, like for 5 minutes. If there's anything, I'm going to come back and answer them. Other than that, for those of you that have watched the entire time, which I'm still, come on, people. It's the semester break and there are still 4 people kind of interested in academic writing. Like, why? I mean, it's nice. I wasn't sitting here alone, but yeah, why do you do that? But anyways, for those of you that have watched and for those of you that are watching it later on, thank you very much for having a look, for trying to find out more on academic writing. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Generally, I'm going to use the next minute to say a couple of words concerning the semester. It was very nice having you all in my seminars. This is actually pretty mean of me, right? I'm going to say that at the end of a live stream that not everyone attended, and I'm going to make couple of mean comments on that. No, I'm not going to do that, but it's very pleasant to have you all in my seminars. I always really enjoy having my students be there in person, also online. I know that semester was a bit difficult for everyone, even for us, weirdly enough. But thank you for having stuck around with me. Thank you for attending the live streams as well as the in-person seminars. It was very, very pleasant, and I hope to see many and some of you in later semesters. I'll probably be still doing a lot of stuff on YouTube. Sometimes it's live streams of games. Sometimes it's other weird things, not only concerning academic writing, but mostly my seminars. And yeah, thank you very much for being here, for listening to me ramble on, and I wish all of you a good semester break. I hope you don't have too many term papers and examinations, and if you do, then I'm crossing all my fingers that you will be very successful in your endeavors, and I hope to see you at a later point, eventually, in one of my seminars. So thank you and bye!